Hey folks, my name is John Lay and welcome back to the channel. Okay, so in the last video we talked about how the partitioning of the Korean Peninsula eventually led to the Korean War that we see in this movie, Ode to My Father. But as I said before, the movie doesn't spend all that much time talking about the war itself. In fact, most of the movie talks about how Koreans moved on from that war, how Koreans progressed into becoming the prosperous society that it is today. And the very first thing that we see in this movie that Koreans did to overcome the devastation of that war was the sending of coal miners and nurses to West Germany. And today we're going to be talking about that a bit more. Now, one of the things that this movie gets right is that there were lots of ads for jobs in West Germany that were distributed around South Korea. And this excited a lot of people. But before we talk about that, let's get into the history for a little bit. We have to talk about this man, Park Chung-hee. Now, he was a South Korean president and he gained power through a coup d'etat. But not long after he became the South Korean president, he believed that it was necessary to gain loans from foreign governments because at this time, especially in the early 1960s, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world and was still trying to overcome the devastations of the Korean War. And in 1961, Park Chung-hee met with John F. Kennedy. And during that meeting, Park Chung-hee sought an international loan from the United States government. However, President Kennedy denied that request. And the reason that was given was that the South Korean government at the time was already receiving aid from other countries. And so the South Korean government was at a loss. It did not know quite where to get this funds from because, as I said, the devastation of the Korean War was all-encompassing. And in order to get the kinds of loans that the South Korean government needed, it needed collateral. But it didn't have the kind of collateral that it needed. But in 1963, opportunity came knocking in the form of West Germany. Now, Germany, as we all know, was divided into West Germany and East Germany after the end of the Second World War. The Western Allies controlled the western part of Germany, and the eastern part of Germany was controlled by the Soviet bloc. Now, West Germany at this time was going through an industrial boom. But because of the devastation that occurred during the end of the Second World War, West Germany had a shortage of workers, and so they needed to import workers from overseas countries. And one of those countries that Germany ended up importing workers from was from South Korea. But how did South Korean workers end up going to West Germany in the first place? Well, as I said earlier, the South Korean government was trying to seek loans from foreign governments, but it failed to get secure loans from the United States. But when the South Korean government realized that West Germany needed workers, they believed that they found a solution. At the time, the South Korean government was looking for a loan of up to 150 million Deutschmarks. But, as earlier, South Korea did not have the kind of collateral that the German government required. But what South Korea did have were coal miners that West Germany needed. So the agreement that was reached between South Korea and West Germany at the time was that in exchange for the loans, the South Korean government would send coal miners to West Germany to serve as literally human collateral. Now, when we in the present day look back at this deal, this sounds horrific. The use of human collateral just does not sound ethical. But we have to remember that in 1963, times were quite different. Again, as I mentioned earlier, South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world at the time. In fact, according to the records that I read up, a typical South Korean coal miner was able to earn up to 3 times more money than a white-collar worker was able to earn while in South Korea, and several times more money than a civil servant could earn. So, competition for these jobs was actually quite fierce. In fact, for every 500 applicants, only one person was chosen to go to West Germany. So when you watch this movie, Ode to My Father, there's a scene when a whole bunch of Korean men are standing in front of a government bureaucrat and are actively trying to compete with each other so they can get this job in West Germany. And to show that they are able to withstand the menial labor that will be required of them, they carry heavy sacks of rice to show that they have the strength that is required from them. And this scene was actually quite accurate. Another interesting fact about the South Korean coal miners who ended up going to West Germany was that they were mostly highly educated. As I said, competition for these jobs was quite fierce, so it wasn't just about how strong they were, it was also how well educated they were. So many of these coal miners were actually high school and college graduates. Now, through these human collateral, the South Korean government certainly benefited. For one thing, it got the 150 million Deutschmarks that it requested from the West German government. But the 150 million Deutschmarks that the South Korean government got was only the immediate benefit. As time went on, these Korean coal miners continued to get paid their wages in German Deutschmarks, and so these Korean workers sent their money back home. Once the German Deutschmarks arrived back home, the Korean government was again able to use this money to go on and spending sprees to help improve the economy. Working in these coal mines was, of course, quite dangerous, as conditions were quite rudimentary. Between 1963 and 1977, more than 100 South Koreans died while working in these West German coal mines. It was their sacrifice that became one of the stepping stones that the South Korean government took to become the economic powerhouse that it is today. Now, a rather interesting factor to consider is why West Germany allowed so many South Koreans to come to work in West Germany. Now, as it turns out, it wasn't just because West Germany required workers. West Germany was able to import workers from all over the world, mostly from Europe. But West Germany was not very keen on getting migrant workers to come from Asia or Africa at the time. So why South Korea? Well, that's because, like South Korea, West Germany was a divided country. After the end of the Second World War, Germany was divided into West and East Germany along ideological lines, and Korea was divided into North and South Korea along ideological lines as well. And West Germany wanted to show sympathy for a fellow nation that was suffering due to an ideological divide. Now, there is one thing that this movie gets wrong. In 1963, Toksu decides to go to West Germany to work as a coal miner. That much is believable. What is not very believable is the fact that Toksu meets his future wife, Youngda, not long after he arrives in West Germany. Now, it's not just men who went to West Germany to work as coal miners. It was also women who went to West Germany to work as nurses. In fact, the women outnumbered the men, whereas there were only about 8,000 men who went to work as coal miners in West Germany, about 12,000 went to work as nurses. Now, the reason why this is not realistic is that Korean women did not go to West Germany to work as nurses until 1966. And this is important because at the time, the West German government stipulated that these South Korean migrant workers would only be allowed to work in West Germany for up to 3 years. After their 3-year visa was up, they had to return home. And so, had this movie been realistic, Toksu would not have met his future wife in West Germany, and that's because she would have arrived in West Germany only after he left. And so initially, the South Korean workers only stayed in West Germany for up to 3 years and left once their visas were up. But life has a way of carrying on, and some of these workers got married and had children. And so by the mid to late 1970s, a large number of these South Korean workers began to protest against the West German government. They wanted the right to be able to remain in West Germany. And so, the West German government relented and let them stay in West Germany. In the meantime, the two Germanys reunified to form one country, and today, there are more than 50,000 ethnic Koreans that call Germany home. So let's take a look at this map again. As I said in the previous video, whenever you see this map, it usually comes paired with this story about how communism always leads to economic ruin and capitalism leads to economic prosperity. Now, again, as I said before, there is an element of truth to that, but that is not the complete story. South Korea was not the textbook example of capitalism. Had Adam Smith seen South Korea at the time, they would not have recognized South Korea as a capitalist country. What kind of capitalist country today would use thousands of its own citizens as human collateral? Things are much more complicated than they first appear. Alright, so that brings us to the end of this chapter. In the next video, we're going to talk about how this movie deals with the Vietnam War and how South Korea's involvement in that war also helped to contribute to South Korea's economic prosperity. Okay, so that about wraps it up. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to click on the like and the subscribe button as well as the notification bell. And if you have a comment, leave that down below. My name is John Lee, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.